So the broadcast is live. Let me set up on Facebook. Okay. And you all can share the link to this. I'll share that in the Twitter. Okay. So why don't we go around and introduce ourselves? I'll go first. I'm Enver, the head admin at De-Classcucking memes for non-sectarian proles. You can also find me as Real Enver Hoxa on Twitter, or Real Enver Hoja. I'm sorry, I got that filthy American accent. And Rob, how about you?
Yo, I'm Rob. I'm a moderator for the same meme page, De-Classcucking memes for non-sectarian proles, and I'm a member of Socialist Alternative.
I guess I should add that I'm also a member of the DSA. Let's get that out of the way. Ego, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is the Independent Ego. You can find me on Twitter at Worthy248. I'm essentially just an egoist, and that's what I believe in necessarily.
Gotcha. Oh, freaking troll in the chat. Don't tell me to read board, Ego. I've freaking suffered through enough of that BS. You can watch my video on that. Ray, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, of course. So my name is Ray. You can find me on Twitter at Ray Murasame, and I'm a systems analyst, and I sometimes talk about politics.
Awesome. It's great to have you all here for once. Maybe we could do this as a regular thing. I don't know. But we were talking about earlier today about the Unruh Sargon debate and a little bit about capitalist development and third worldism. Now, I know that Ray's our resident expert on third worldism. And so, like, what does it mean to you, I guess, what in terms of theory or practice or however you want to define it?
Okay. Since the question gets put to me first, I know third worldism is basically a tendency toward revolutionary globalism, which posits that it is not possible to reach full development in the first world until first the third world has been capable of catching up. Therefore, you increase development in the third world to overcome semi-feudalist fetters against capitalist development in order to bring them up to the same level. At this point, it becomes impossible for the first world to continue to offload the social consequences of capitalist reproduction onto the third world, and it brings things to a point where internal contradictions have to be addressed within the countries themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a very clean and simple description. I like that. I think that now you've read my article, kind of addressing some of the problems I had with Third Worldism as like a political project. But I think that you're absolutely like right in the sense that and this is what I appreciate about it: this necessity to develop the entire global economy, especially the third world, where this like the semi-feudal mode of production is really a fetter on both like the economy and kind of social development. And you get which is a source of all these kind of reactionary movements and political formations. You look at like ISIS in the Middle East. You and you see all these kind of social problems also in Africa, in South America. But I mean, everywhere has social problems. You can kind of
Exactly. It's just that in the case of these people, you can't follow the normal route of development of just injecting capital and allowing capital to develop as it normally would, because you end up with this strange relationship that builds up, which they call semi-colonialism, semi-feudalism, in which you have semi-feudal warlords who rule at the behest of external actors, which then, of course, ends up with a very lopsided economy as well. And the only way to get forward out of that is to use the force of will and organization to push through and essentially carry out the kind of national bourgeois development has been necessary throughout history. I think Unruh on some level knows this as well. It's just that somehow when he went to that interview with Sargon, he completely forgot everything that he allegedly had believed.
Yeah, I saw that too. It was really weird. Like Carl was weirdly uncritical of the Rue. He kind of just accepted his definitions of a lot of things, and they actually the things that they did end up arguing about was about like the definition of inflation, which is not what I thought the central debate would be.
Exactly, it was very weird. Like, I was actually surprised to see the kind of stuff that was going on. Like, what was that about? Why would they have an argument over the definition of inflation? You should get more to the underlying point, which is that Sargon is saying something which is slightly different from what Unruh is saying. Not only that, but there was the weird thing that happened later on. I think it was, let me see, do I have a timestamp in front of me? Yeah, around 13 minutes and 43 in the Sargon thing, Unruh describes what New Democracy is, and you can't really tell from his tone of voice whether he thinks New Democracy is a good idea or a bad idea. And if you watch down to the end of the interview, it's almost like he thinks New Democracy is a bad idea or something. Because when Sargon comes out and says to him that, oh, okay, so how do you feel about capitalist development in the third world, such as Southeast Asia and so on, Unruh suddenly takes massive objection to all of this. Which is kind of strange, given that you would think that he would prefer the development of capitalism over the previous iteration of semi-feudalism.
Yeah, that is very bizarre. I think that I think that Jason has a problem overall with having his politics and his like rhetoric kind of more determined by his own like sectarianism and his like who like what who we'd have to defend or whatever than any actual positive political idea. I know that he attacked me as an anti-proletarian Trotskyist. That was his words when I after in his response to an article I wrote. And honestly, that seeing him on Twitter, it's very much kind of just schoolyard kind of factions and that kind of stuff. He doesn't seem to want to play as much on the grounds of his theory, but it's not about that. It's about what flag you're waving to him, I think. But I could be wrong. If you guys have a better idea of what's going on there.
It can also be that he's held captive to what he perceives to be his audience as well, because I find that the more that you believe that you have a very hypercritical left audience, the more you're unlikely to want to concede anything or to say something that someone might think is heretical. For example, even in that interview with Sargon, for example, Unruh felt like he had to use the word revisionism, for example, to describe China as it presently is. Like, it's not like someone was asking him whether it was revisionism and he decided to say that it was. He offered that without Sargon having to induce him to say it.
Because Sargon was going to accuse Jason Unruh of supporting China, and it's like, well, this is still a socialist country, so like the Marxist-Leninist like reaction to people who support capitalism is to explain to others what is socialism and what isn't, and so it just gets bogged down into what is socialism, what is true socialism, what's true capitalism, and debates like that go all over the place because everyone has different definitions of what is socialism and what is capitalism.
This is why I miss Jehu. Because I mean, he had it very simply articulated, didn't he? And so he was able to really put sort of classical liberal interlocutors in a bind on this, because he would simply come out and say, okay, well, we've decided that socialism is defined as that process in which labor time is being reduced, and then he would say, okay, so what is communism? Communism is free time and nothing else. And then that puts the ball in their court, because then they have to ask you a bunch of questions as to what that actually means, instead of it being the other way around, which is the classical liberals interrogating you as to how you would classify individual states, particularly when these states don't even self-describe as having reached socialism. For example, if you asked officials in the People's Republic of China whether what they have is socialism, they would say they do not have this.
Precisely.
Right? Am I wrong?
No,
Precisely.
I think they would say that there is. It's funny because I had the pleasure of sitting through a presentation put on by this economist, Chinese expert, who was working for the Confucius Institute. And for those who don't know, that's an organization funded by the Chinese government. And his whole thing was that, oh, well, China is partly socialist, and he listed off of these kind of critiques of there's not enough democracy or whatever, but there is this kind of state ownership. He didn't talk about like private property or anything like that, which was striking. But it seems like in terms of what they're trying to sell right now, they want it both ways. They want like, oh, we're a modern like market economy and all this kind of stuff, which is what they've been selling to like the World Trade Organization, all that kind of stuff. But they still kind of want at least a little bit of that mantle of socialism and people's like the mass movement kind of aspect, I guess, and the representation or whatever.
Yeah, that's why I think it's crucial to understand Zemin's theory of the three represents, which is they view themselves as building the preconditions to socialism. And so that active attempt to build the preconditions is probably how they're rationalizing that they still have that people's element going on. And so they probably view everything that they're doing as a massive detour after they realize that you can't actually just spontaneously get what you want. It's the same thing that happens in Vietnam as well, where I think Vietnam made the concession that it's going to take a lot longer for them to get to where they think they're going to go. And so everything that they're doing is rationalized as a kind of socialist market economy, socialist-orientated market economy.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So they won't deny that they're a market economy which is presently engaging in capitalist accumulation. They will just say that they're doing it with the conscious effort of preparing the way for what comes after that, whenever that would happen to be.
I mean, that was essentially Lenin's justification for the NEP as well.
Yeah.
So it's fairly standard.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Except for some reason, when Unruh was in that debate with Sargon of Akkad, he suddenly forgot this and instead wasted significant amount of time defending the Soviet Union while actually attacking third worldism, ironically. For example, he put he was very critical of Mao Zedong at the beginning, which I did not expect him to be, but okay. And then he didn't mention Lin Biao at all, which was kind of strange. Did not mention Dien Idit. Did not mention actually any of the people who are actually involved in formulating third worldism. Like none of those people were mentioned. Not even people who were outside of the usual left spectrum. Like he managed to get through the entire interview without talking about any of the African leaders that he had alluded to, any of the Southeast Asian leaders he alluded to. No one in South Asia was mentioned. Well, actually, he did mention Jose Maria Sison, but only to criticize him.
Well, didn't he say at the start, or did I mishear this, that he's trying to move away from the Maoist label? Like he said, like don't direct people to Maoist Rebel News, direct them to Jason Unruh. That would explain it.
Oh, yes. He did say that as well, which was kind of a strange U-turn.
I mean, this would also explain the, calling Enver here a Trotskyist, because that's way more of a Stalinist thing than a Maoist thing.
Yeah, I think people who have been influenced by Mao probably, or anyone who's associated with his surroundings, I don't think like usually you have people running around calling people Trotskyists. Like it doesn't matter. Like if you're a Trotskyist, okay. I mean, if you look at the Trotskyist Third Camp, for example, which was headed by what's that guy's name again? Noah Shahatman. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Probably.
No.
No idea.
Yeah, but anyway, the Trotskyist Third Camp believes many of the things that that Third Worldism believes. They're almost indistinguishable if you put on a tight enough blindfold. The reason I know this is because if you look at the organizations that were rising up against the Iran government recently, I mean the left-wing organizations that were coming out against the Iranian government, many of them are Trotskyist Third Camp. And when you read how they explain what it is that they're doing, it is very, very similar to how third worldists explain the actions that they're taking. And so I don't see how that would be an insult either. Like if you keep calling someone a Trotskyist, like, oh no, you agree with me on probably like 90% of things that you have said? Kind of a strange thing. But I mean, even then, we see this all across the internet anyway, because I mean, from the other side of the spectrum, you're having conversations with, say, neoliberals or something, and neoliberals, for example, will start calling you various names, like perhaps will call you a Trotskyist or something, as though you're supposed to be insulted by that, but you're in full agreement with them, at least in the medium term, full agreement, quote unquote, with them in the medium term on things that need to happen. Like, I don't think, like, I hate to say like we are all neoliberals now, but I don't think that anyone is arguing against international development. So I don't think anyone is arguing that the size of the state needs to be expanded and then handed over to a bunch of weird nationalists. I don't think anyone is actually saying this.
I think that the people who are saying it probably have the White House's ears in that regard. If like what's going on right now is any indication. I forget what his name was, the trade advisor that Trump is listening to right now, whose whole thing is basically just we have to reduce imports, increase exports.
Peter Navarro.
Yes, that's it.
And he's also listening to Wilbur Ross and Robert Lighthizer. All three of these individuals are completely mental. Well, no, I should not say they're completely mental. What they're doing is actually calculated. Like it's a deliberate attempt to shore up cronies.
Yeah, that's the only rationale I can come up with it. But it's not. It's such a like narrow interest group that somehow managed to capture like national policy. It's quite incredible.
Yeah. It goes to show in a way the power of I guess racial antagonism. That the idea that people could just cynically do that and then getting to power with a very, very, very thin wedge of industrial concerns on the basis of like some feelings about the fact that the US is 64% white.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's something that like it's ironic because I think companies used to and capital used to be much better at this. That they would use racism or whatever to further their interests as a whole. Now it seems like it's a much smaller group that kind of figured it out and are using it for their own advantage. It's really bizarre to see because it is on such a purely ideological level that even if like the people who are getting what are people getting out of this? It's not like there was like the tax thing, right? So you make a bunch of billionaires happy with that, But for the most part, what the people who are sticking with Trump is this kind of satisfaction of just it's almost Freudian or something of seeing liberals lose their mind about what's going on, and it's not like some of the things like are like liberals lose their minds about lots of ridiculous things, but some of them like you're happy because people are losing their minds about something that's really like actually insane. Why are you happy about that? You know?
Well, it also has to do with nostalgia. Going back when wages were better, or back when wages were great. Because I've had conversations with my parents lately about these tariffs, and I said how ridiculous it is, because of it's gonna fuck up the whole world. And my dad's like, well, back in my day, American workers used to earn a living, and now we're being we're losing the competition with other countries, and so their justification is based off history of what it was back then, the false perception of what it was, and like this nostalgia back to what wages were, back to good paying jobs or middle class, and it's kind of delusional.
Yeah, which is very ironic considering the response to that to support these tariffs is not that, oh, we need to become more competitive, we need to improve our comparative advantage or whatever. No, we need to decrease competition, and which is, I mean, it's certainly not a new thing. I think the strategy of states for as long as capitalism has been around has been to simply decrease competition abroad, increase competition at home to as like a populist kind of thing. And that's been a recipe for, well, one like kind of political success for whoever, a very catastrophic thing oftentimes for global development.
Right,
no,
right.
We often talk about this thing. Well, I mean, even the title of this stream involves the word cucking. Like, I mean, is there any greater cuck than a consumer who is deliberately voting for policies that will drive up the price of every item they have to buy? Like, congratulations on reducing your purchasing power so that Donald Trump can feel special. Like, what is that about?
But I'm getting to feel special through him.
Yeah, to feel special vicariously through him. I mean, that's really what it is, right? I mean, people talked about the Schadenfreude and the and basically, the idea of, quote, owning the libs, right? I mean, that's basically what it is. I've had people say to me, for example, even though I'm not even a liberal, they'll say, oh, yeah, well, we're doing it just to make people like you angry. And I'm thinking, well, technically you haven't really hurt me, though. Like, I'm kind of like perturbed at the foolish behavior, for example, but we still signed the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we're still going to have RCEP, and South Korea is still going to join Mercosur, and Japan is still going to be the leader of the bloc that is being created because the US has abdicated its position. So, like, why would they think that I would be upset by this? They're just shooting themselves in the leg. I guess everyone is slightly poorer as a consequence, but in terms of like the global order of power, they have not elevated themselves in that global order of power. They've just shot themselves in the leg in the hopes that it would somehow harm us. Because I mean, they're not even doing it. Yeah,
it's
they're
like
not even doing it intelligently.
To the whole world and say, "Ha, look at what we're doing. Take that." And basically, Trump is doing these tariffs as like a thing of let's see what happens. Like he's gambling on the effects of what people might do after these tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Yeah, basically. And he's gambling on what we might do. And the really genuinely foolish thing about it is when they first introduced the first round of tariffs, the ones where they were tariffing like washing machines and stuff like this, the outrage, I guess, made complete sense because you could see how they were doing it because Gary Cohn was still there and he was probably advising them on how you would go about structuring things in an oppressive way. And so if you were going to oppress nations of the third world and other developing nations in the second, for example, you would set tariffs in a way where you'd be tariffing the finished products of these countries, but you would not be tariffing the raw materials, because you want to extract the raw materials so that people in your country will be given the sort of, the labor aristocracy, cush jobs, and everyone else outside of your country would have to be essentially just digging bauxite out of the soil, right? It's obviously horrendous, but that would be the smart way to do it if you were trying to reinforce semi-feudal relations in countries that you import raw materials from. What makes this absolutely stupid is that those tariffs, they then turn around and put tariffs on the raw materials as well, thus counterbalancing the entire thing. So the net effect is that they've actually nothing but increased prices on themselves.
Yeah,
and I think that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Obviously, Cohen was willing to accept many, many things. Sort of act stupidity, he had to go.
Yeah, I actually, one of my family members actually wrote part of the DOD thing that was sent to Trump and the White House about why this is such a the reason that they gave for these tariffs, right, was national defense. But the DOD was very much against this stuff because partly exactly the same reason you were saying. It's natural resources. It's the stuff that they need to make all this tanks and whatever. If you increasing the costs of that, you're just going to increase the costs of producing all these freaking weapons. The idea that and I saw something in the news about this, that they never actually challenged the national security reasons for going around WTO the guidelines. They've never actually challenged that. And if they do challenge that, there's a very good chance that people aren't going to actually deal with it. They're not. It's a lose-lose situation. Because over what? Because the steel and aluminum capacity of the U.S. is well enough for whatever national security resources or that you need in a wartime effort, and it's not. So that's there if we need it, or if the DoD needs it rather, but they're not actually using that right now because it's being used for other stuff. The net effect right now is simply that it's going to make things more expensive, which makes absolutely no sense from their perspective.
And I think one of the reasons why Peter Navarro was able to get away with having these weird views for so long is because of the fact that nothing he's ever done has been peer-reviewed, apparently.
Seriously?
Yeah. Apparently he just writes stuff. And no one actually peer reviews it.
Why does
the way that which he
hire me? I can do that.
Yeah, indeed, I have no idea. And then not only that, when Jared, apparently there's a story which cannot be confirmed, but apparently I think it was H.R. McMaster or perhaps John Kelly had asked Jared Kushner whether he knew anything about China, and they had some conversation. And so either it was Kelly or McMaster. I'm going to assume it was Kelly for the moment. And so Kelly said to him, "You know nothing about China. Why don't you go find it and come back to me?" The kind of way that Kelly would behave with, the annoyance that is Kushner, right? So apparently Kushner went off, sat down in front of his computer, Googled the word at Amazon, and selected Peter Navarro's book, which came up, Death by China, read the book, and then suggested to Trump that he should bring Navarro on. That was it.
That was the reason?
That was the reason. And it's so crazy. Well, obviously they already had other protection. They've chosen these protectionists out of deemed people or something. They've lived bombastic people who have been around for about 20 years talking nonsense, and now they have a chance to actually bring them into government. That's literally it.
They're really scraping the bottom of the barrel with this one.
Yeah. I mean keep in mind, Navarro was a person. Navarro was a person who published a non-sourced document which consisted of 2 pages, one of which was a graphic. And on the graphic was something like how free trade is making you have more abortions. Seriously. With the assumption, of course, that abortions are a, quote, bad thing, even though they are not, but let's, pretend that is red meat for their demographic or something. It's crazy. And people are sitting in, like, having to actually look like crap talking points on their basis.
Yeah, Navarro's becoming a trade secretary, and there's a possibility that John Bolton will be part of Trump's White House too.
Oh yes, that's the other thing I should mention. Yes, Abraham McMaster will probably be gone by next month, and he will be replaced by, which is going to be all.
Yeah, it's going to be terrible. Anytime you see Bolton, just prepare for war. Just prepare for war somewhere, because that's how it usually
Also,
ends.
the irony behind all of this as well. The alt-right have just spent the past, how many years is it? About 10 years now, right? The alt-right spent the past 10 years all over the internet, in your freaking inbox, tweeting at you on Twitter aggressively, all kinds of nonsense, telling about how they're against all of this stuff. They would never seek to politically enable these alleged wars for nations other than the one that is the US, as they like to, blame everything that happens on Israel, for example. Now here they are, literally enabling the entire thing on a level that has not been seen before. Because I don't think, like, if you did a comparison, let's say you did a comparison in terms of, like, who benefiting from policies that have been implemented, I think it's now a settled view that the Trump administration has been most beneficial in terms of deliberate actions, not their mistakes, in terms of deliberate actions, has been most beneficial to Israel and probably to no one else, not even its own country.
You could maybe say Saudi Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia, of course, yes. The entirety of that, what's called the moderate crescent, which is basically Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and there's a country I'm missing somewhere in here.
Egypt?
What is it?
Russia?
Well, no, that's not the moderate crescent, is it? It has to be the Middle East.
Oman?
Turkey. Right.
Turkey. Oh, God.
Yeah, almost forgot that. Yeah.
No, I think even though he's coming in, I mean, you couldn't even make that argument about, like, isolationism with McMaster there. McMaster was the one who was pushing for war with North Korea more than anyone else. And I'm honestly glad he's on the way out in that regard. But they can't, like, I felt for a moment there that, okay, maybe they're not actually going to do something so stupid as to get us all into a massive war, either with Iran or North Korea or whatever. But it seems like whoever comes in next, it's going to be the same damn thing. It does seem like maybe North Korea issue is thawing a bit, but now with Mattis's thing now, this was his plan to, like, refocus to China and Russia. Well, now we're in just, like, I guess it's a less likely scenario that we would go to war with either of them, but still, it would be exponentially more devastating if that kind of tensions do actually result in something. We talked about a bit earlier in chat about, like, what would probably be the effect of a major war today. What has more, like, predictive power, I guess. Crisis theory of that this kind of violent conflict will create some kind of potential for change, create some kind of mass movement, socialist explosion, or whatever, or if, as we saw in the 20th century, are going to see kind of great wars as a method of regulating the development of capitalism itself, raising the rate of profit, destroying like capital to do so, and so on.
I'm going to go with the latter. because that seems to be the entire purpose of the Make America Great Again concept.
You might be right.
I'm gonna take the UACC position, the unconditional accelerationist position, that this is basically accelerating towards death. Mainly due to the fact of like war is more wanted, not needed, but it's wanted on the basis of America being quote unquote weak and people in society being quote unquote weak. So the demand for war will be exponentially greater than the demand for profit at that rate.
Those are probably the same thing from a certain perspective, but it's what you should remember though is that
yes, I think we're all saying the same thing. Are we just getting here quickly? I think we're all saying the same thing here because we're saying that we're dealing with a group of people who are willing to forego their own profits, i.e. forego global growth, for the sake of maintaining their relative position in the global hierarchy. Does that make sense? I.e. they'd rather be king of a mountain of trash than be middle class in cybernetic future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
At least for like a certain part of the ruling class, their fortunes are directly tied to war. Like, you got to remember that there's a huge part of like the Beltway, like DC, parts of Virginia, parts of Maryland, where their entire industry is just trying to convince people to go to war. Lobbyists for the defense industry.
Yeah, as somebody who.
But I would say that all war is not made equal. For example, if someone were to openly declare a war that happened to be occurring like in the middle of East Asia, for example, that would be a qualitatively different intent than, say, just funneling more funds into existing wars, such as the one in Afghanistan. Because at least in Afghanistan, you can make the argument that we're here for the lithium, we're here for the copper, and we're going to use it to make renewable energy kind of stuff, like electric car batteries and whatever. However, if you kick off a war in, say, North Korea for your amusement, for example, that's qualitatively different because then you're just reducing global growth for no apparent reason because you didn't need to have that conflict. But you wanted to do it in order to make it so that be significantly less than it otherwise would be, so that you can, quote, make America great again by getting a leg over. And so I think these things would be qualitatively different. So I wouldn't say that every single person who is involved in lobbying for war or being involved in the defense sector and so on is automatically implicated in this kind of behavior. It depends on what it is that they want. Or yeah, I guess all wars are not made equal.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. As somebody who lives in that kind of beltway area, I've got lots of family with ties to the defense industry and that kind of stuff. It's like nobody, like the rank and file people who do all of the bureaucracy and the work, obviously don't want that kind of stuff, because it would be devastating. But I think that even like the defense industry would certainly profit a lot from and it does today, from the kind of conflicts that we see in the Middle East that aren't like game changing, just a constant grind against like terrorist forces like Al Qaeda and ISIS and that kind of stuff. And certainly, I think they could probably make a lot more money if they're like in an arms race or something. But it's not really the defense industry that's probably going to cause like a big war. It's a certain and we're seeing that now. Like you look at McMaster, who's kind of pushing for it the most right now. It's not like there's a certain mentality in the intelligentsia of like the Beltway. It's different from the defense industry. Like certainly there's defense industry money and all the group think tanks and stuff, but there's a certain attitude of people, especially in the military itself, who of use of tactics over like long-term strategy and stuff that I think tends itself to get into conflict. And that's where we see a lot of this stuff coming from. In terms of like the the profit drive and all of this, it is very much like like a certain person's profits like will go up if you just reduce that amount of capital, that amount of development, because what you're doing is you're reducing an enormous amount of competition globally, and you're opening up like these massive markets where there's suddenly a massive need for your products all across the world in these war-stricken countries that need to be rebuilt or whatever, and also for munitions or what have you. But it's like the absolute number like of profit does increase, in exactly because global development and global growth entails the decrease of profit over time.
So the question would be what's more profitable, getting in war or solving it through trade? I think that's the question.
Getting war, absolutely. It's no question.
I would have to argue. I'm going to do the controversial thing of arguing the opposite. That in terms of, if you look at the entire planet, it would be less profitable to engage in war than it would be to continue the development that's presently ongoing. It's just that it's a matter of the fact that certain groups of people want their relative position to be higher than it actually ought to be, and so they will choose it even if it results in loss. Or those groups of people would like to choose it even if it results in loss. And this is why you will see, even within the context of the US, you've got essentially the Trump administration doing all of these weird, aggressive-looking actions, and then you've got other groups of people who are consistently criticizing this, even though they themselves are also neoliberals. It's because it's different factions of different factions and interest groups who all happen to be conforming to neoliberalism, but who have their profit motives aligned differently. This includes people who would be involved in the defense sector who are like, no, let's not do this. Let's not do these particular actions. So I don't agree that it would be more profitable for them to engage in war.
Well, I think that there's a big difference between war and wealth, or I'm sorry, with profit and wealth, because certainly like global trade and that kind of neoliberal regime increases wealth. That's pretty well established. What profit is different, though, especially I guess I should say the rate of profit is specifically different, because the way.
Okay, yes, I agree with you. Then, if you say rate of profit, then yes.
Yeah, I should have made that distinction.
It would certainly increase the rate of profit. Absolutely.
I mean, I think you're onto something there, Ray, though, because, I mean, it's always going to be more, you're always going to generate more wealth overall if you spend your money on developing rather than blowing things up. But, like, let's not forget that the interests of the state are, they're different from the interests of the ruling class as capitalists. Like, the point of the state is in maintaining the hegemony of the ruling class. States, unless they're state capitalists, aren't specifically interested in making a profit or even in which specific companies make a profit. They're interested in safeguarding the interests of the ruling class as a whole.
I would make a distinction. Like I have a certain different view of the state. That's a very Gramscian kind of view, I think. To me, the state it's not just about like ruling class hegemony, because it's like we've seen many examples of the state acting against like the interests of the ruling class, and certainly trying to incorporate like aspects of counter of things that are traditionally outside of its hegemony, bringing it into its like ideological apparatus and so on. To me, the state has a more fundamental thing that it has a job of transforming the violence that makes it up through the military, the police, through all these kind of things, and transforming that into legitimacy, which takes a lot of effort. It's what the bureaucracy is for. It's what like propaganda and all these kind of, and just what and what it does in its everyday kind of activities are geared towards this of trying to create legitimacy for itself. So I think
I would argue that the state is an abstraction, but the abstraction it's an abstraction that people believe in, like the police, the military, etc. The state only exists because we basically all believe it to be existing. If every single person in the country, say of America, everyone stopped believing in the state and its laws, which will never happen, but let's say if it does, the state would be abolished in one day. Sterner talked about this in his book, The Unique in Its Property, saying like if the state just basically was not cared upon by everyone, by day one, the state would collapse. And similar to the labor of the working man, if the labor becomes free, the state is lost. So basically, if everyone just stops caring, the state would be eventually gone. But Sterner probably realized that's impossible due to the fact that many different people believe in many different things. So the belief system of the overall necessity of the state is a huge problem with many people, and that's why some of this violence continues. Some of it you see more liberalized, more freedom-ish, quote unquote freedoms. Others, it could be more totalitarian or authority driven. So it just depends on the state in question, is what I'm trying to get at.
Well, I think that's kind of going to the same thing, because legitimacy, what you're trying to do when you create legitimacy is exactly to create that kind of belief in the state, not both as like that it exists, but that it should exist, that that these things, that the state has a right to exist and do these things and what have you. The what Because that's kind of its job, really. It has to self-perpetuate in that way. If it couldn't convince people this, then yeah, it would fall apart. But it exactly has skin in the game to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and that skin in the game is called modernity. It entraps many people into believing in this legitimacy by justifying it through acts or through pieces of paper, like the Constitution, for example. Well, according to the Constitution, I have a right to, protect the law. Well, what happens when this piece of paper is gone? Well, the legitimacy of it is gone. So they had to find another way to justify it. So they have all these layers of justification molded into one big giant state. And no matter how much you criticize it, they're just going to use another rhetorical argument or a rhetorical trick. And that justifies status quo, essentially.
Well, I think I wouldn't. Would be careful of putting too much emphasis on like rhetoric as what's controlling people to do these kind of things, because rhetoric, I think, far from being like the determining aspect here, is kind of a necessary aspect of any kind of like attempt to control people, attempt to have power. It's like the power needs some kind of deeper material base, some kind of, or else someone else doing the exact same thing would blow right through it. But if you don't have that kind of rhetoric, it's kind of it's more difficult. I think it's a lot easier to convince people not to like rise up against you than to just constantly have to fight them.
Well,
It is kind of like this game of like minimizing the violence of others and maximizing the violence of your own. You have to do some kind of calculus to figure out what's the ideal level to maintain your control, basically.
Right. Well, like as well as being an abstraction, the state is also, commands an army, which is a very real thing. And the point is, it's not just to it's cheaper to convince people, but the point is that if people do stop believing in it, you send a whole bunch of guys with guns and tell them that they better start believing again, or else you're going to burn down their village. And so, like, as much as like probably there is profit to be made in the invasion of places like South Korea or Iran, um, let's not forget that these are countries that are a challenge to the international neoliberal order. And the reason why they're being threatened militarily is because that's just the only way that the dumb old state can. It's the last resort, right? And we'll see if it actually happens.
Well, yeah.
I'm thinking that if someone decided that they were going to do Iran, they probably wouldn't go directly for Iran first. They'd probably want to start things in Lebanon. And I would guess that the way that they would want to do this is they would perhaps come out and say, okay, Iran is sponsoring, and bear in mind, heavy quotation marks around all of these statements. So I don't want to see like people like cutting this clip up later and making it sound like I'm saying these things. But they would say that perhaps making the allegation that Iran is somehow sponsoring various groups around the world which are engaging in nefarious activities. And then they would say that, okay, since Hezbollah exists in Lebanon, that will be the excuse then to say that, okay, there needs to be something that will be done to remove Hezbollah from Lebanon because it's not a group that is supposed to be there, and so on. Saudi Arabia would have probably supported this action. And then you'd be able to kick something off in that country. Perhaps you'd even have a case where you might want to have some kind of, it's difficult for me to describe, some kind of Sunni rejectionist group could somehow just spontaneously appear, as they tend to do, and be like, oh, we don't like Shias anymore, because we never did. And then suddenly you have a conflict. Something like this. Like, I don't think they're going to come in literally and be like, okay, let's send the US military directly into, like, Iran. You'd have to escalate it from something. And so based on the behavior of Jared Kushner and of Mohammed bin Salman, I would guess that if they were going to do something like that, you would see them begin with Lebanon first. Perhaps they would even try to put a sort of rubber stamp legitimacy on it by taking their complaint to the UN first and saying that perhaps Hezbollah is a paramilitary group operating illegally inside Lebanon.
I think you're exactly right. Certainly, Saudi Arabia already has many Sunni front groups in Lebanon. Not at least not at the moment to like openly confront Hezbollah and start a kind of war, but it's pretty easy to see how they could be repurposed for that use in such an event. And of course, Israel has a stake in that game as well.
Exactly, because they have fought in south of Lebanon before, haven't they? What was that operation called again?
Oh, I can't remember, but
was it called Operation Cast Lead?
Yes. You mean in 2006?
Yes, that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, and Lindsey Graham actually, he recently said, I think just like a week or so ago, after he came back from the Middle East, that Israel was preparing for another war with Hezbollah. And certainly there's been a lot of tension.
Wait, when did he say that? Within the last 3 months?
Yeah, it was February 27th.
Wow. You got me there then. I didn't realize he had said that. That's an incredible data point.
Well, there's been some action involving Israeli strikes on Hezbollah targets in Syria. And certainly Israel's been making some noises about that for a while now, but might be heating up again.
I think that the Syria aspect of that is certainly what we're seeing the most development in right now. The Pentagon kind of really wants to maneuver in such a way to cut off, or at least make it more difficult than it is at the moment, for Iran to supply Hezbollah directly through Syria. Right now, which is what they're using the YPG for. It besides trying to get rid of ISIS, of course, there's kind of a secondary, larger strategic goal in there, and they succeeded to a small extent. Right now, Iran would have to be forced to go through very Sunni-heavy areas of Iraq to get to the more normal path in Syria to Lebanon.
But you're forgetting that the PMU is mostly the Iraqi army. Like Hezbollah militia groups, known as the PMU, are all across Iraq. So they would eventually find a way into Syria, and they would eventually find a way to Lebanon.
Oh, I'm sure. They would be able to do it. Of course, it just becomes a bit more difficult when you have to go through the areas that have a lot of ISIS and Al Qaeda kind of operatives and support. They definitely find a way to do it, and I don't think that the Pentagon has actually succeeded in preventing this kind of corridor from developing. And certainly the problems with Turkey have made it even more difficult to accomplish that. But
because they hoped that FSA, the Free Syrian Army, would be able to topple Assad, but as we've seen in 2016 with the battle for Aleppo, basically the rebels have lost. They've lost all ground, and they're basically losing the civil war. I mean, the only way it's not ending is because of Idlib and some pockets in Damascus. That's the only main rebel strongholds at this point.
I think the Turkish-controlled Syrian opposition, quote unquote, are calling themselves the Free Syrian Army as well. But it's really hard to keep track. Like, so many different groups call themselves the Free Syrian Army.
Yeah, certainly you have like Al Qaeda, which is also kind of, if not Turkish backed, is certainly cooperating with the Turks and Idlib. The Turkish groups are mostly composed of ethnic Turkmen themselves, which is kind of interesting. That honestly, what has probably united Syria the most is a kind of hatred towards Turkey right now, which is quite surprising to see from at least some anecdotal accounts of how willing the Arab contingents of the SDF, the umbrella group for the YPG, were willing to kind of go to fight against Turkey in Syria, in northern Syria, because there is still kind of a nationalist undercurrent that we can't really dismiss with like saying, oh, this sectarian group here or that. Syria was like Arab nationalism and even like the Syrian nationalism and what have you still exists. It's just kind of the complicated realities of what's going on makes it difficult, like, for Western observers to kind of understand it, I think.
Also, the other problem that's been happening from the very beginning is the fact that these people keep renaming these groups, and people who are only paying partial attention start to lose track of who is actually what. So, for example, you talk about Al Qaeda, right? I mean, Turkey is, for all intents and purposes, pseudo-covertly supporting supporting Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, right? And of course, we know what that is. That group was formed on 28th of January 2017 as a merger between Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, formerly known as al-Nusra, the Ansar al-Din Front, Jaish al-Sunna, Liwa al-Haq, and the Nur al-Din al-Zenki movement. So that's kind of like you've got a whole bunch of basically Sunni Islamists who believe in Salafism and Wahhabism who have been placed in one bucket with a group of people who previously used to be answerable to Al-Qaeda, but now claim that they are in fact not answerable to Al-Qaeda, but they're still the same actual individuals.
Yeah, it's very fascinating to watch. It's like, it appeared at least that that the split in al-Nusra from larger Al-Qaeda was kind of facetious and fake. But I
Yes,
think
not only is it facetious and fake. I mean, even on Wikipedia, their allies are listed as literally, quote, Al Qaeda Central Command, Turkestan Islamic Party, Ansar al-Islam Splinter Faction, Soldiers of the Caucasus, Katiba Abd ar-Rahman, Caucasus Emirate, Soldiers of the Mahdi, Malhama Tactical, Katibat al-Gharaba al-Turkestan, Al-Rahman Legion, 1st Brigade of Damascus, Saraya al-Sham, and Southern Front. Only sometimes. Like, it literally has in brackets after it, sometimes. And the Southern Front being the FSA, of course.
The Jordan-backed FSA.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing to watch this stuff evolve in front of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, these are the good Al Qaeda that General Petraeus likes to talk about. The Al Qaeda who are only worried about their own backyard, and they're not going to trouble us over here in the West. As basically, we've given up on winning the global war on terror, and now we're just worried about, like, okay, can they keep it over there? Can it not come back here?
It's absolutely ridiculous. And plus, anyone that's actually read the founders of these groups knows that they're not going to keep it over there. I mean, the whole purpose is not to keep it over there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Al-Qaeda's claim to fame, in contrast with many other Islamist groups, is their belief that you have to fight the far enemy first instead of the near one.
Right, but I think, like, with was Hayat Tahrir Asham, like, part of the name Asham, right? Like, it's Asham is Syria, so, like,
Yeah,
it's
of the Levant.
explicitly referring to the fact that, you know, this was part of the renaming, was like
to try to make it seem more localized.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham literally translates to the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant.
So we, yeah, obviously this is a nice creative bit of fiction that the
Exactly
trying to pull. Like, if they did actually take over Syria, oh boy, would it not end there?
I think you're absolutely right, but I also think that there is a genuine tension there of the leadership in Syria and the larger Al Qaeda organization. That, like, in terms of immediate, like, what they're trying to do in Syria is kind of consolidate that control first. It's very, and we're kind of seeing the same thing in Yemen.
It is an existing tension. It is an existing tension because I don't think that Ayman al-Zawahiri fully agreed with the things that they went on to do. It's just that he later came to accept this. So I think the Central Command for Al-Qaeda later came to accept that they were going to do these territorial games. But at the beginning, they were against these things, as far as I'm aware. Because they prefer to be these kind of like wildcats who are waiting to kill us in all kinds of strange places, right? But by making themselves a territory, they've essentially staked their claim on something which they can then fail or succeed by.
Which is kind of why
I don't think they like to make those commitments.
Yeah, I think that's kind of exactly why ISIS has somewhat been eating their lunch in terms of the game for converts into, like, radical Islamist organizations in the past couple of years, is because they were the ones who did in Syria kind of transform that into a more, like, outwardly facing kind of battle as opposed to one for, like,
the irony of this, however. The irony of this, however, is that which one of these strategies for them in the 5th generation warfare is actually more intelligent? As far as we've seen, if for example, we have a kill ratio against ISIL now of, what is it? It is 15,000 to 1. That is the kill ratio as of, I think, January of this year. 15,000 to 1. So from that perspective, I mean, coming out into the open like that has resulted in the deaths of thousands and thousands of jihadists, right? So it may be that the only reason that ISIL was more attractive was because it attracted the more stupid people. Al-Qaeda, ironically, was too sophisticated for these idiots.
That is a very nice way of putting it.
Didn't one of the leaders in Al-Qaeda said that, like, ISIS was so bad, like, they even thought they were too extreme for their own good? I think I remember hearing that before.
Yeah, that's probably the argument that was had. That was the argument that was had between al-Zawahiri's people and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. They had that conversation, and that was actually why the ISIL split happened in the first place. why ISIL stopped being part of Al Qaeda, because they wanted to go directly into creating this attempt at their Islamic state of whatever, right? Whereas Al Qaeda was saying, do not do this, because then you've put yourself in a physical location from which you will be burned alive by in Operation Inherent Resolve.
It is interesting because you still see this kind of divide in ISIS itself, between like the foreign fighters and the people who live there and kind of more passively support ISIS and that kind of thing. It's always the foreign fighters who come in who are that much more radical, ideological, and that kind of stuff. And I think that similar effect in Al Qaeda is kind of what drove them towards the more territorial approach in these kind of conflicts now. That they have to deal with like the local population more than ISIS, that is thriving off of just the ideological global battleground. And we've seen kind of how that's turned out.
It's a losing game for both of them, however, because I don't think that any of these Salafist jihadist groups are capable of understanding culture. And this will sound strange for me to say this, because you think, well, they do have a culture, right? No. In order to understand the radical Islamists, you have to understand that these are people who have been unable to attain a culture, and so are essentially engaging in a massive psychological LARP, a live action role play, essentially. There were several authors who talk about this. For example, the further you get away from the cultural grounding, the more things start to depend on extreme signaling to other people of your piousness and ritualistic behavior. So, for example, you find, like, on extremist forums and so on, people talking about, what is the appropriate way to wash your hands and stuff like this, right? Because all of this is basically the signaling where they're trying to kind of set themselves apart from the new world that's being created around us. Very much comparable to what you see the alt-right doing, for example, where they'll object to things in ways where you think that, are you mentally ill, kind of thing, right? But it's not that they're mentally ill, but rather it's that this is one massive virtue signal.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
It's just a right-wing virtue signal. And this is why when you put them in contrast with, say, the more grounded form of Islamists, which is still bad, you see this tension emerge, because there are people who actually have to live in these societies, whereas there are, on the other hand, these other people who are in this kind of like first world disconnect mode, who have been imposed upon these populations and are running around doing all sorts of crazy things. So, for example, when ISIL came there and said, okay, well, you're not allowed to smoke cigarettes anymore or we'll shoot you, right? This is something where if you say that in the third world, that's a freaking joke. That's a joke. I think most people in the third world smoke cigarettes. You can't come there and say you're going to ban people from smoking cigarettes. You have to kill about 100% of the population then.
Oh, yeah.
But there you go. And so this is the kind of thing where the person is not culturally grounded, and so they invent all kinds of rules which are very pious and then undermine themselves thereby. Al-Qaeda also does the same thing. Because, Al-Qaeda itself is a reaction, because Saeed Qutb went to the United States and saw people dancing in a church and got offended. That's literally it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what we're dealing with. It's very similar to when you see the leaks from these alt-right groups and so on, and you hear them discussing, like when they're out of our earshot and discussing among themselves, the kind of things they say about women, the kind of things they say about minorities, the kind of things they say about their views on sexual morality and things like this. All of this is a massive performative game that they're playing amongst themselves, and it's at everyone else's expense that we have to endure this nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you define like being cultured? Like in a good, it seems like you're doing it in a positive way.
Not necessarily in a positive or negative way, but there's a difference between actually having to live the thing that you're talking about versus you've just arrived on the scene and you have some kind of you're completely dislocated. So a person who actually has to live on the scene would probably, like in a Syrian context, for example, they kind of look like how normal Syrians looked before the war happened. And the reason for that is because they actually have to live in the material environment and deal with the social problems on a day-to-day basis. So, of course, they're not going to come to the kind of stupid conclusions that you see these people from outside coming to. This is why, there was a protest against Assad in 2011, yes. But the people, the kind came out for that protest against Assad, other than the Islamists who had been, attempted to infiltrate that uprising. The initial uprising excluding the Islamists, was essentially local people who felt that the situation was improving for them, but it had not improved fast enough. Economically speaking, that was what it was. However, lurking in the backdrop of all of this was also the Islamists, who quickly then took over the entire thing within the space of about, I guess, less than a month.
Yeah, you see the
And
exact
so,
same thing in like Kashmir, for example. But to expand your metaphor with like the alt right, it's in this like dissonance between culture, like the authentic culture, to the extent you can call it that, and these kind of people who are more virtue signaling. The alt right aren't the old, like they're not the like old conservative guard. They're not like, there's a big difference between for example, a like Dixie Boy, Confederate flag kind of redneck or something like that, and your average alt right person in America. It's like there are these people who like live in these certain like isolated rural communities, or if you want to go like the in terms of gender relationships and stuff, there are people who live in like this more conservative, hierarchical kind of thing. Um, Usually religion has something to do with it, what have you. This isn't like from that. It's explicitly like framed as transgression against like this liberal order. So these people are coming from like liberal like areas with like liberal backgrounds and stuff. They're
yes, I fully
explicitly
agree. Yes, I
dismissing it.
fully agree. That's what I'm saying too. I fully agree. These two things are separate phenomena.
Exactly. And
That's why they tend to look so different from each other when you put them next to each other. That doesn't, of course, mean that any of these two things are good. It just means
oh
that
yeah,
that's why they have these different qualities to them. For example, in Syria, there are, in fact, of course, rural, local-born people who believed things that were absolutely horrendous. After all, it was they who forced the compromise in the 1975 Syrian constitution, in which the word Allah and all of this other religious stuff was inserted into the top of the constitution in order to placate those people in the countryside, because it was becoming too socialistic for their liking. So that doesn't mean that there wasn't always this kind of latent conservative element in a large section of the country which had been essentially suppressed, right? It's just that there is a contrast between that behavior and what later would appear from outside. Because people who come from outside don't have to respect what was actually happening prior to their own arrival.
Yeah, I'd actually like to. I think Nico, you said that the foreigners who join these sort of groups are more radical, but like, yeah, I tend to say that they're certainly more bloodthirsty in a very performative way, but like from all the reports I've read, most of them like don't know a fucking thing about the Quran, you know, like the locals, you know, they they all just say that these guys are a bunch of Westerners who don't know anything about the land that they've come to.
yeah. I think that's a good point. It's exactly because Ray used the word virtue signaling. It's because it's exactly that. When you're so focused on just this kind of, it's almost an aesthetic, really, of trying to transgress against like modernity, against this like perceived, like if you're a Muslim in the West, it can be a kind of alienating experience, especially if you're not in like the Muslim community. That's where we see a lot of these people come from. They're not um, the kind of people oftentimes who go to mosque regularly, maybe more so with Al Qaeda, less so with ISIS. They're the kind of people who are more isolated, and the same. It kind of fits the school shooter kind of archetype more than your like an Islamist you might find in the 60s or 70s, right? It's um, it's very much that exact thing of virtue signaling, because it's all about except in like kind of the reverse. Well, for the alt right, it's more reverse. When you're talking about more traditionalism kind of stuff, it is just virtue signaling. You're signaling, oh, how devout I am. Oh, how but it's still kind of just about transgression. It's transgression against modernity, basically.
It's trying to be proud about your traditions and your Islamic culture, while like they're trying to realize like how do we move forward into the future? I mean, like modernity is like trying to kill us. So Islamists just think, well, I gotta double down on the killing because they'll eventually kill my culture. So they're thinking in terms of tribal groups. And they are looking for identity. As Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian professor, once said, the quest for identity is violence, and they are trying to look for an identity. And so the only way they can express this quest, express this adventure, the search for identity, is to kill people, basically on the notion that they'll eventually find something. They will, quote unquote, feel something because they've been alienated from the culture that they were living in. And the times are changing really fast as well for them.
Well, I think that it's a bit different in the context of is Islamism around the world, because especially in the Arab world, where and Zizek brings up a great point about this, that it's not it's tribalism, but it's also when compared to the West and when compared to modernity, there is a certain like subtle embarrassment of like your own backwardness or whatever. But the response to that isn't to like for some people to like embrace modernity. It's that no, my way was right, and I have to like become confident in that and retrench myself. Um, and that is like probably a different certain
Yeah.
outlook than the kind of Western converts and stuff. But I think it is there in terms of the homegrown insurgencies in the Arab world.
Yeah, it's kind of like a sort of jingoism without a state.
Yeah, that's a great way of summing it up.
Yeah, instead of learning from an inadequacy, they instead choose to just wage war against whoever it was that insulted them, even if that person did not directly insult them. It is simply living in a way that is producing better outcomes than they are. There's also like some of these Western quote converts or Western recruits, because there are obviously people in the West who are already Muslim who decided that they were going to go to these places. I mean, you're talking about an extension in some cases of, when you talk about people who haven't read the Quran and stuff like this, you're talking about an extension of an inner city gang phenomenon, right? So previously, you had people dealing with radical Islamists, and so these are individuals who are radicalized toward violence by their extreme interpretation of Islam, right? And now instead what we have is a kind of reverse of this, in which we're talking about Islamized radicals. In other words, these are people who already were criminals in a different context, and then they went to prison, and then in prison they encountered people who told them that they needed to come back to God and various things like this, the usual kind of thing. And so the working through of their apparent salvation seems to be to basically throw off their criminal past and then reutilize their criminal predilections toward some kind of foreign policy purpose. So essentially, becoming very pious, which is the worst kind of pious, because then they think they're better than everyone else, which is then they end up in Syria. They're in the real-life video game, shooting real-life people who they never really met and didn't actually care about, because it's really all about themselves anyway. And there you go. And then you legitimize a violent street credo.
Yeah,
you get the loyalty, and then people send social media messages talking about how successful they are and how they've got 7 wives and are prancing around with an AK-47, and suddenly you've got a whole lot of people interested in this nonsense.
Yeah, it has to do with that religious basis, and you kind of see it with white nationalists too. It's kind of similar in that regard, like.
Yeah, well, they'll say, "Oh, I used to," they say they used to be radical, they used to be a liberal, and then the message reached them, and they became red-pilled. Like, this is literally the exact same stuff that you see from the recruitment in Belgium and the United Kingdom and France, when Islamists will come to young young Muslim men, and we'll say to them, oh, well, you've been down on your luck, you've been discriminated against by the system, and, we understand why you had to behave the way you did, but now you need to put yourself in service of a cause, supplying false papers and weapons, or carrying a gun, or doing some other kind of illegal activity, since you're already an illegal person anyway, and God will reward you as a consequence. By comparison, if you just substitute God for the ethno-state, you've got essentially the same kind of psychological behavior, in which it's not really a strategy, but more a redemptive effect.
Or replace the word God with the white race. That basically encompasses a whole bunch of stuff, and the whole entire concept of a white race is flimsy because each European has a different type of culture. And like, it's kind of comical when the white nationalists use like the talking point, well, we have multiculturalism. It's called France and Germany and Britain, but like it's actually like mocking their whole ideology themselves subconsciously, because there's no way you're going to have an imperium. There's no way you're going to have a big white ethno state in Europe.
But plus, not only that, but they'll immediately deny this if one of us comes out and says the same thing. Like, for example, I can't recall the number of times that I've said to people who self-describe as white nationalists, I've said to them, oh, well, don't you already have an experience of multiculturalism anyway? You have in Europe a lot of countries in which our majority, whatever ethnic group is originally from that country, with a small number of people from somewhere else that have also come in. But they're like, no, we're against multiculturalism. Really? And so it's very confusing. Not only that, but I've also encountered white nationalists who will repeatedly claim that everyone else is discriminating against them, but then if you try to assert your own racial interest, they will immediately deny that racial interests are a thing that should be considered because, quote, identity politics is cancer. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say on the one hand that basically you believe that there's this thing called the white race and that it has specific interests which are tied to its material alleles, which are, inside you and inside every person who is within a certain group of people who originate in a particular geographic space, but then also turn around at the same time and say that this does not apply if anyone who is a person of color asserts this exact same thing about their own group, because then it's inappropriate.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's trying to
biggest hypocrisy.
They're trying to get back on the so-called like racial prides of other groups. Like, well, like say for example, my family kind of talks about this sometimes. They're like, Black History Month. Oh, what's a Black History Month? Why can't we have a White History Month? And I just had to go and explain to them, we have the 11 other months of History Month. So like this base is like this feeling that whites are being discriminated against. It's a feeling that's creeping into my life, and I'm hearing it more and more often. I'm hearing regular ideas of a race war coming too, and
wow,
I'm just amazed of what's going on. Like, all the stuff I've been looking at online, it's coming to real life. Like, these people are actually believing that a race war will happen soon. It just depends on a current event that's going to happen any moment now. Unreal.
You're saying these are not like online people. These are people IRL.
I mean, there certainly isn't a completely new meme in that regard. Like, the ideas of race war, at least in the U.S., goes back like as far back as there were like race relations and stuff, especially in the 60s, 70s. I mean, even in the freaking 90s. But it's kind of the thing that gets me is that I forgot where I was going with that. There was something about
you were saying that these concepts of race war are not new.
Yeah, they're not new at all. And what were you saying about before that, Ray? With
oh, the strategy of them, on the one hand, suddenly asserting that race definitely exists an important social aspect, and then on the other hand, as soon as you agree with them, they're suddenly offended by the fact that you agree.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I remember encountering one person who was a white nationalist, who described themselves as a white nationalist, and then and was going on all kinds of rants about IQ and so on, being racially connected. And then I brought up an article saying, "Oh, these Nigerian girls are outperforming native white British students and stuff." And he said, "Yeah, because Anglos are stupid," and and I was like, okay. I think his exact words, yeah, because I hate Anglos or something like that. I was like, so are you a white nationalist or are you like an Aryan nationalist or something? Are you just a regular Nazi? You can't like claim this big mantle of like the white race and then pretend those kind of divisions don't exist. But they're conscious of this. I'm 100% certain that they are. They know how to like twist the rhetoric of this to their greatest advantage, which is whichever one suits the situation.
Yeah, and like it also shows you that they don't have a real identity for themselves too. Like clinging on to like Islamists, like the white nationalist clings on to this identity because they have to them they have no meaning in life. So they're trying to find meaning in life and they're basically trying to look to the past. And they're trying to incorporate every single thing into the past and bring as much as quote unquote good qualities of the West and bring it into the future. I mean, I've had talks with people how like these people, these right accelerationists want to basically destroy civilization and then rebirth it like the phoenix rising from the ashes. And I kind of find that perplexed for many reasons, due to the fact that a lot of fucking people are gonna die for one, and like once their civilization is gone, I don't think it'll be coming back in time because you'll be essentially playing on the communist ground. That why do we need the civilization in the first place? We could just got rid of it. Why do you want another new stage? So, like, it's kind of ridiculous to these people. Like, their whole worldview is either do or die, life or death. It's a dichotomy that they have to live through because they want to live through it because they're trying to find an identity in life.
Well, I think that precisely because it is an identity, this kind of thing is, at least on some level, purely rhetorical and ideological. They don't actually, in terms of what they actually do, it's not quite reflected in that because it's they're trying like look at like Trump's election, for example. They're not trying to create like like in terms of practical steps. Electing Trump was not one to create this like big race war, ethno state, whatever. It's because it is, oh, maybe it's the first good step or whatever, the true hardcore Nazis. But on a more fundamental level, I think that that's just a big myth hanging in the background. And the much
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say like I listened to Richard Spencer debate with David Charette, if you know who he is on Twitter. He's like his name on YouTube was Spinosaurus Kin. Now it's Alternative Facts. Basically, I was watching through that live stream. Well, after it was done, I was watching through that live stream, and like David was just like pressing on like his ideas of a white ethno state. Like, how are you going to achieve the white ethno state? You're not doing anything about it. This is not a whole like a view agreed on by every single white nationalist. Just the more popular ones, like Richard Spencer. Spencer believes that he's waiting for a period of history, where there'll be the quote unquote right moment to enact the ethno state. He doesn't believe that the ethno state will arrive anytime soon. He thinks he's preparing for a new generation of white nationalists to come up and eventually take over the country known as America. Um, like this viewpoint comes from Spengler. If you don't know who that is, Oswald Spengler was like a German philosopher, kind of, who lived in Nazi Germany. Didn't like the Nazis that much, but he wrote this book called The Decline of the West. And basically what Spengler's ramblings about is that history isn't full of cycles. It's like the civilization itself, it has cycles of decline and the opposite of decline, greatness or something.
The classic image of great men make weak men and all that kind of crap.
Yeah, it's that meme, and I think that meme comes from Spengler. And Richard Spencer was interested in Spengler ever since 2011. He was talking to another far right intellectual, quote unquote intellectual, by the name of Jonathan Bowden. Ray knows about Bowden, but I know more about him because I've read him and listened to his stuff on it. And they basically talked about how there'll be this platitudes or this historical period where the opportunity is just right to enact the ethno state. But when do they predict that, or when they predict that the ethno state will eventually come and people will take action? That remains to be seen.
Sounds a bit like Marxists waiting for the revolution.
It's, you know what it is? It's like the pre-Marx, like Hegelian kind of understanding of culture and the state, in a way of it's certainly more cyclical in that sense, but not completely, because if you're going to have that kind of moment of a creation of an ethno state, that's not a entirely cyclical thing. That is a progression towards something. It's Hegelian in the sense that, like, Hegel saw like the state and culture as being these like two determining things. Like the state was like, how do I put this? It like how you create like better culture or something like that. I may be completely off base. I'm not like a Hegelian scholar, but it seems to be coming from that sense of historical, not materialism, but still like a dialectical historicism of not like materiality, but culture, and what in that cyclical nature of it. Which,
yeah, and they think that eventually, like that meme, good times create strong men, and so on and so forth. Like they think that they are preparing for it by speaking the gospel of the right white race, essentially. And they think that by speaking it, people will actually do it. But what Spencer is not getting at this point is that basically the more people listen to him, the more people hate him, especially from the right. And with no action and no, like, they have all the talk, but they can't do the walk. So they're not doing the walk currently at the basis of, well, we're just not ready yet. But at the same time, they'll say, well, we did this action here in like the tragedy of known as Charlottesville. But what got accomplished? Nothing. The Confederate statues went down. So basically, it was a negative outcome. And like people on the right are starting to think, well, Richard Spencer might be a Fed, because there's no way in hell a nationalist, a white nationalist with that much of quote unquote high IQ would make such a move unless it was intentional.
That's kind of ridiculous in hindsight, considering all of the other figures from the alt-right that were involved in Charlottesville. But it was kind of spectacular failure in terms of optics for them. I had two comrades from my YDSA chapter who were there in Charlottesville who heard the car crash, and it was like the impact that it had, and certainly like galvanizing people against them was enormous. It did seem for a moment that was kind of a death knell, but like with all the crazy stuff that's happened since, it's kind of like it's still there in popular consciousness, but it's not the kind of ultimate destruction for the alt-right, because they're, even if they stop calling themselves the alt-right, all the connections are still there. It's still like a network of people and forums and so on, and in outlets, news outlets especially, that are still going to be pumping out these specific viewpoints. And that's never going away so long as there isn't some kind of another kind of radical realignment in terms of the media sphere.
Right, like
right.
A material base, like Richard Spencer has a passive income that isn't going to go away.
Yeah, but he's motivated by that passive income, isn't he? That passive income he's generating, doesn't that come from some kind of agricultural cotton-based thing in the south of the US?
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, and so you can even rationalize that many of his political positions are designed for the purpose of shoring up his own economic interests, his personal ones, that is, as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I don't know, like, I think it's something like he has shares in a trust or something like that. It's all the money comes from his family. I don't think he's actually ever done a day's work in his life.
Yeah, I don't think he doesn't do it himself, of course, but you know what I mean when you talk about someone's assets. It includes their family as well, generally speaking.
Yeah.
That's where they're getting it from, because I mean, you assume that your own family will share with you. The other thing that I noticed about Charlottesville, in terms of them just being dumb, is that the whole concept of unite the right, which is what they claimed that they were doing, which is bringing together disparate strands of the American right wing along with the alt-right as one sort of solid point of protest. And it was supposed to be an opportunity, I guess, for them to all meet each other or whatever. Like, I kind of feel like it was not some conspiracy, but rather it was just that they were actually dumb and essentially rose to what was the Antifa challenge. Because, of course, the Antifa came down there like it would tend to do and say, okay, come at us, right? And what did they do? They did precisely the thing which the Antifa requested they should do, which is to come down there and have a go at them. And what was the net effect of this? Because if you think about the way that the alt-right views situations, they often view things through the spectrum of almost like they almost view things like kind of like sales and marketing people would. That there's no such thing as bad publicity, and you're going to, well, even sales and marketing people don't really believe that, but the idea that you want to get your name talked about and you want to create some kind of spectacle event, regardless of what the effects of that event are. So, for example, they did not calculate that during that same time, Gary Cohn was having that whole spat with Donald Trump, along with the people in the what was it called? The Industrial Something Council. Give me a second, I'll just quickly check what the name of that organization was. It was something that Trump was operating.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yes, it was called the U.S. Government Manufacturing Council. So I'm just going to quickly read off what I quoted at the time. Quote, President Donald Trump's Council of Senior Business Leaders who advise on strategy and policy is disbanding, according to a person familiar with the matter. The Executive Council, which is led by Blackstone Group LP Stephen Schwarzman, planned to inform the White House Wednesday before making the announcement public, according to the person who wasn't authorized to discuss this matter. The Manufacturing Council hasn't met since February. The CEO CEOs of and Merck quit earlier this week, and on Wednesday, Inge Thulin, CEO of 3M, left, and so did Campbell Soup CEO Denise Morrison. Following yesterday's remarks from the president, I cannot remain on the Manufacturing Jobs Initiative, Morrison said in a statement. I will continue to support all efforts to spur economic growth and advance the values that have always made America great. And then we also had Gary Cohn destroying himself, so I'm just going to quickly read that off. This is a lesson that the stock market and a raft of CEOs have learned this week. There's no net price to pay for defying the president anymore, and no reason to bet on his success. Mitch and Ed's journey to courage is a miniature of one of raft of CEOs blazed this week as they quit Trump's advisory councils. The speed of Trump's 7-month disintegration into a laughingstock may shock. This is on Market Watch I'm reading from, by the way. But the market being wise to him isn't totally new. Back in January, it was documented that Trump was tweeting about a company. That when Trump tweets about a company, there is basically an 80% guarantee that the stock will move in the opposite direction of what he predicts. No one thinks they have more to lose from defying him than the sensibilities of their clients, business partners, employees, colleagues, and now even voters in a purple state like Virginia, whose disgust stiffened the spine of an even reliable partisan like Ed. Even politicians get it now. That means that Trump's influence on tax reform, infrastructure, and more may be over. It will be entertaining to see what happens next month, etc., etc. I'll just skip along quickly. Unless someone takes charge of this government, as Trump can't, the market will discover a level of pain no tweet could ever cause. Right, so why were they saying these things? It was because this that I'm reading here was on the 28th of August 2017, so that was literally after Charlottesville had occurred and the fallout had happened. Now, obviously, in the case of Charlottesville, you had lots of people down there who were doing horrendous things, chanting horrendous slogans, engaging in anti-Semitic chants and stuff like this. What these people had forgotten is that within Trump's own cabinet itself and within the sort of structure that Trump has built around himself during that time period, he had a mixture of different groups of people who had different levels of what's the word for this? Different levels of comfort about the kind of coalition which had actually elected Donald Trump. So coming out there and fighting Antifa, chanting anti-Semitic memes, and then driving a car into someone resulted in a situation where Trump then had to make a choice as to how he was going to triangulate between these different groups that he was trying to appease. So, of course, Trump then comes out there and does that equivocating thing you saw him do, where he said, oh, well, there are violence on both sides, right? Mm-hmm. As soon as he had to be compelled to say it that way in order to avoid pissing off anyone, he had successfully actually alienated many of the people who were on his side, because many of these people whose names I've just read out here, including Gary Cohn, who was drafting a resignation letter when he heard that. And then, of course, Trump found out he had tried to draft a resignation letter and never forgave him, but more on that later. Many of these people, their surnames are in fact surnames which would be commonly found in the Jewish community. So how is Trump going to square this circle? Well, the fact of the matter is that he can't, and this is why the Manufacturing Council had to disband, and you saw all of these people get up and leave. This created a massive dearth of professional advisors, people who understood the economy and what was actually going on. All of those people got up and walked out. So by simply appearing at Charlottesville, the alt-right effectively created a scenario which led to the sabotage of Donald Trump. Now, I do not know if anyone in Antifa organization, because I've never been able to talk to a leader of anyone amongst the Antifa, right? But I don't know if they actually planned for it to be that way. But, round of applause to them if that was the actual plan. Like if someone actually sat down there and thought, how can we exploit rifts within the right wing of the United States and basically bring them all to us and let them have this stupid display, which would then cause these rifts to occur? Because that was fucking brilliant.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that they actually had that level of planning, knowing I have a friend who does like the black bloc kind of stuff. It's definitely more of an attitude, no, we just got to confront these people and make them afraid or whatever. The consequences, though, were very fascinating. I think that what we certainly see this big rift happen between the actual captains of industry, the actual economic experts and that stuff, and Trump. That there's almost, like, now that Gary Cohen's gone, there's almost no connection between them anymore. But he
was the last tenuous connection on sanity that they had as well, incidentally. So I mean, and this is not to praise Gary Cohn, because I would never do that, of course. But it took him a long time. I mean, he wouldn't leave at the beginning. He wouldn't leave after Charlottesville, even though he was considering it, because we know that he drafted a resignation letter and had considered giving it to Trump after he had given that shameful display on international television. And then there was another time after that when he was about to quit, which was when he didn't get the Federal Reserve job, because that's what he actually wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the last nail in the coffin of his tolerance for this nonsense was at the point where Peter Navarro came out and put the steel tariff on. That was when he was like, okay, goodbye.
Yeah, I mean, at that point,
in fact, I'm seeing and I'm seeing a pop-up here now on my desktop as well that's saying that this is Gary Cohn's last day, and that Trump has insulted him to his face, apparently.
What great timing.
Yeah.
I think but it's very fascinating that kind of rift between industry and Trump didn't result in kind of a big repercussion on the stock market, because it was kind of incredible. I was kind of also a bit confused myself, like the stability at which the stock market increased up until just last month, when we saw the big drops. And I did get some answers to that just the other day when I was reading that Politico article that I tweeted out about it, about is basically explaining that, the stock market doesn't really care too much about these things because like Trump is still doing, at least up until now, like regular Republican things in terms of economic policy. And then the other aspect is that the stock market is almost, to a large extent, run by algorithms and not by people who would get so alarmed by headlines like this. So what is the big changes on the stock market now are the purely economic indicators, and not things like Trump saying, the fascists and the anti-fascists are just two sides of the same coin or whatever. There's violence on both sides.
You have to remember, though, like Trump also said stuff about industry, like with the tax cuts, especially the tax cuts. We're going to lower the taxes on corporations who are bringing back jobs in America. Like the speculation, just on the word of Donald Trump saying that, the stock market goes up. But once the next day comes, it goes down when he changes his mind, or when it turns out that's not the case. So the stock market is still in speculation. It's still in somewhat depending on Trump's word, but it's getting to the point where it's less and less like that. They're starting to see, okay, maybe we shouldn't trust Trump on everything he says until it's finally signed on paper, because we can't trust his word. Who trusts his word at this point? I mean, I just, like, he changes his mind like he changes his clothes. It's really fast.
I mean, that's exactly the point, though, is that we don't see that kind of volatility we'd expect from that kind of behavior in the stock market. And up until like last month, it had been rising fairly stably for like the first year of his presidency, which didn't make much sense to a lot of people, but it's like the fundamental economic situation was still one which, like, the stock market had a lot to gain from, which is kind of why I mentioned this when in my tweets about it. We have what are actually the most sophisticated commercial supercomputers we have working on the stock market, trying to guess prices and that kind of stuff, doing the kind of job of the socialist cybernetics the cockshot kind of loves. But, for
Cyberson?
Huh?
Cyberson?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Basically, it's our stock market now. But I think that like Trump's impact on industry is like, we're going, like, if there is kind of the big economy kind of crisis that he causes some kind of big problem. It's still yet to come. There's something like the fact that he's so concentrated on culture wars up until the tariffs thing is striking. The tariffs, though, it does seem like the one thing, which is almost, it feels to him almost like a culture issue. I think that's what it is to him. And that's why he cares so much about it, which is very ironic. It remains to be seen exactly if that'll come to fruition, the kind of concrete, like, shuttering of the global kind of trade regime that we've had. Certainly, the U.S. is losing its leadership place, but it still kind of remains intact and would remain intact so long as there are exemptions for Mexico and Canada.
Well, yeah, it's a small decline of America, but we're seeing the effects of that decline of America being a superpower. We're seeing the miscalculations and the misjudgments that Trump has been putting on to the stock market, and what he says and what shit he spews when he talks about the market. It's also reflective to notice that compared to Hillary Clinton's plan on the military and increasing the size of it, like comparing Trump's plans for increasing military spending and Clinton would have had more equipment and had a lot more vehicles and production more effectively than, say, Trump's, because Trump's depends on specific qualities of equipment and of vehicles instead of, compared to Clinton. Clinton had all these equipments ready, and she planned on increasing the size of the military incrementally. So it's not at a rapid development. Whilst Trump wanted a quick military now, he wanted all this equipment now, but at the same time, he needed to be efficient. And so, looking at the two plans, you would see that Trump would actually make the military situation even worse. It wouldn't, like, his whole military expenditures are messed up because he doesn't know where the numbers are coming from, essentially.
Well, sure. I think that, like, the military is, while they have had, like, free reign and a lot of stuff, they haven't had, like, the problem with the military budget is really a problem of Congress at the moment. And I think that, in terms of the current kind of priorities in, like, the defense industry and the DoD, there was a push early on to refocus production to create jobs, which was kind of incredible at the time, because up until then, the focus on from the DoD in terms of acquisitions was always to be efficient, to get the most equipment with the least amount of money, right? But if your purpose is to create jobs in the economy, it's the exact opposite. You want to create, use, like, get the most amount of labor for the money that you have, which is incredibly inefficient. I don't think they actually followed through on that, because it would have, like, you would hear a lot more complaints about it. I think that overall the military has kind of been left to its own devices under Trump.
Yeah, it's like, who controls the military, the Pentagon or Trump? And I'd probably say the Pentagon more controls the military itself more than Trump.
Mm-hmm.
This is Trump's thing, is he likes to listen to the generals, right? Like, oh, these military guys know what's going on.
Yeah, which to me is kind of the number one danger of the Trump administration, and I kind of mentioned this before, with what drives us to war more often than anything else. It is kind of like the military's like desire to solve these kind of problems with like tactical use of the military itself. Like who is the biggest pushers for war? The administration. It's always it's always the generals. It's McMaster. It's um, and and then you see like Mattis with his refocusing and what have you. Um, there's that big danger, and you saw this with Lyndon B. Johnson, especially. He was the one who trusted the military a lot more than JFK. And I think that kind of reflected a lot of his decisions in terms of Vietnam and what ended up happening there. So, if we do get into like some kind of big conflict, I think it would be because the military um, gets us there basically.
What? Well, wasn't there like an article recently about one of Trump's advisors like preventing Trump from actually saying, attack North Korea? I heard something about that. I think it was a rumor or something. But like military officials have actually warned Trump not to take any action in North Korea too, because it's on the basis of how much of a catastrophe it would be, not only on the ground in South Korea, but also in the political ground, because it's it's a it's a quote unquote Mexican standoff with North Korea and America. They want to see who shoots first, but both sides don't want the shooting, except for Trump, of course. But like they're waiting for someone to shoot, and the military is advising Trump, don't shoot anything. Like this will ruin our whole entire situation in Korea and South Korea, because they just elected a new president that's having more ties with Pyongyang. Um, they the election results basically are saying, look, we don't trust it really, America. We want to negotiate ourselves with North Korea, and it's just ruining all the relations in that area in general, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, the military is going to be for some wars and against some other wars. I think like you can't forget about the CIA here, because they have their own idea about the kind of wars that America's been fighting, and they don't often agree with the DoD. For example, in Syria, you have the DoD back in the Kurds and the CIA back in the jihadists.
I think that the thing that McMaster said was basically like the headline of this Business Insider article is Trump National Security Advisor just said the U.S. is ready to take North Korea's nukes by force. In another place, he said war with North Korea was increasing daily, or the odds of North Korea uh, of war with North Korea were increasing daily. It, like certainly there is always those divisions in the national security apparatus, but as we talked about before, there's always like this underlying um, kind of like what like the material undercurrents of what's really driving us to war in terms of the rate of profit and things like that. In terms of the really big wars, I'm curious how much longer you guys want to keep chatting. Um, uh, I'm not really sure what would be a really good stopping point, or if there's something you guys want to bring up.
Oh, we've been going for what, like 2 hours now?
Just about.
Well, I don't really have anything. I was just my goal in this live stream was to like observe what you guys are saying, but it seems like I don't know. It seems like I had some stupid opinions on it.
No. It's. I mean, you can't just leave all of us to our circle jerks or whatever. It's important to talk these things out, to really develop your ideas. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
because I'm like a neutral kind of observer, kind of.
The radical centrist.
Radical centrist. Well, basically an egoist looking at everyone else and thinking, like, what is the best option here?
It's the supermarket of ideology. What are you going to put into your cart?
Yeah, it's like a shopping cart of ideology. I'm in the grocery store. I'm checking out some of the products and seeing which one is the best. And like it changes too. Like my opinion of stuff changes because I'm trying to be like Marshall McLuhan and this thing of I'm just observing the environment as it is. I don't want to be the type of person to defend like an ideology, say like communism, for example. It has so much overtones of it that like people think of it like differently. Like if you talk to someone about communism, people in America will think, oh, you want the Soviet Union back, or you want the Chinese, Maoists back. Like it's kind of counterproductive for me to explain my actual like opinions on it because they're changing. And I just don't know for sure. If that makes any sense.
It makes sense because I think that it's important to like get like the phrase that I always hear when you talk about the supermarket of ideology. It's like all supermarkets fit only for looting. I think that if you're going to take serious like being principled or having an understanding of your own ideas, you have to accept that you can't just take every idea or take like a whole person's work and just say that, oh, this is my ideology. I'm going to follow it to the letter in order to be like consistent, or it leads to a certain dogmatism. I think that the best way to go about things is generally to take like the ideas from wherever you find them that you think are most appropriate, and see and compare them to like the framework that you're operating in, or your own like framework of ideology, and come to a certain arrangement where you can kind of square all these kind of ideas. It'll probably be difficult because they're probably not meant to be squared together, but I think that's the most principled way you can go about it.
You think so?
Yeah. Well, that's what I do. I'm a very stubborn person, so my views don't actually change that often. When I do, it's usually just to get more in depth to something.
Yeah, well, you'd hope that like when you discover new facts that contradict the old facts, that you change your opinion. I'd say that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. I was actually freaking writing a paper on like the rate of profit in the social democratic period versus the neoliberal period. And I had this whole theory kind of worked out of what I was going to explain, what was going on. And I looked at some of the raw data for the social democratic period. Completely, like I was like completely ass backwards of what I was actually thinking. Like, well, all right, you have to rework your theory, but it doesn't mean you have to like throw everything out, you know? Wow.
Word.
So yeah, I don't have a topic to talk about unless
stopping point then.
Anyone else does.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was great having you all here. I had a lot of fun.
Likewise.
Mm-hmm. We should do this again sometime.
Yeah,
it was pretty
number
good.
2. Is this like
me and Bray had a discussion a while back, and I said, oh, this will be Roundtable number 1. So this is number 2.
Yeah, and this is number 2 for me too, because I had a discussion with Ray recently through the Alt Universe podcast. It was an interesting discussion we had. I think Ray would agree. So
yeah, it was pretty good. This one was good too. And so we should do these more often.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess we'll try to schedule something in a group chat sometime. In the meantime, I guess we'll sign off for now.
Later, guys.
See ya.
Later.
Good night.
Right, see you. Bye.